Robert Altman's haunting 1971 Western wasn't just controversial, it was almost sabotaged by its own studio, featured genuine opium dens, and accidentally launched careers while nearly ending others. From a donkey that destroyed a neighbor's lawn to Leonard Cohen giving away his music because he loved a flop, and a cinematographer whose groundbreaking technique was deemed ineligible for an Oscar, this anti-Western hides some of Hollywood's strangest production stories. Here are the 15 weird facts you didn't know about McCabe Mrs. Miller. Fact 1. The Presbyterian Church complained about the title. When Robert Altman first started developing his unconventional Western in 1970, the movie had a completely different name that would have told audiences exactly what kind of story they were in for. The original working title was The Presbyterian Church Wager, which referred to a bet that some of the townspeople make in the story about whether the main character John McCabe would survive after refusing to sell his businesses to a powerful mining company. The title made perfect sense because the fictional town in the movie is called Presbyterian Church, named after its most prominent building, a tall but mostly unused chapel that dominates the landscape. This wasn't just a random choice by Altman and his screenwriters, but a deliberate irony since the church remains largely empty while the town's most successful and civilized establishment turns out to be McCabe's brothel. However, the religious reference in the title created an unexpected problem that the filmmakers never saw coming. During production, officials from the actual Presbyterian Church organization contacted Warner Brothers directly to express their strong displeasure about having their denomination's name associated with a film that centered around prostitution, gambling, and other activities they found morally objectionable. The church leaders made it clear that they did not want their faith connected to Altman's gritty and unconventional story, which depicted the harsh realities of frontier life without the heroic mythology that traditional Westerns usually embraced. Their complaint was serious enough that the studio felt compelled to change the title to avoid any potential controversy or legal issues. The filmmakers went through several alternative titles, including John McCabe at one point, before finally settling on McCabe and Mrs. Miller, which focused on the two main characters rather than the setting. While the name change eliminated the religious controversy, it also removed the original title's hint about the gambling culture and fatalistic atmosphere that would define the entire movie. Fact 2. A runaway donkey ate the neighbor's lawn. One of the most unexpected expenses on the McCabe and Mrs. Miller budget had nothing to do with elaborate sets, expensive actors, or complicated special effects, but rather with a hungry donkey that couldn't resist a perfectly manicured lawn. During filming in the rural areas around West Vancouver in 1970, one of the animals being used for the production managed to escape from the movie set and wandered onto a nearby neighbor's property, where it proceeded to have what must have been the feast of its lifetime. The location that Robert Altman chose for building the fictional town of Presbyterian Church was in a sparsely populated area, but it wasn't completely isolated from civilization. The production had rented land from a developer who owned expensive luxury homes with swimming pools and tennis courts on one side of the property, while using the undeveloped barren land on the other side to construct their elaborate Western town set. This meant that the movie's horses, donkeys, and other period-appropriate animals were living relatively close to well-maintained residential properties. The escaped donkey apparently had excellent taste in landscaping because it made its way directly to one of these neighboring homes and discovered a beautifully maintained lawn that looked far more appetizing than whatever feed it had been getting on the movie set. The animal spent considerable time methodically eating its way across the grass, leaving behind a thoroughly chewed up and completely destroyed yard that looked like it had been hit by a very selective natural disaster. When the property owner discovered the damage, the production company had no choice but to take responsibility for their runaway performer's appetite. Warner Brothers ended up having to reimburse the homeowner for the full cost of reseeding the entire lawn, which created a line item in the movie's budget that probably surprised studio executives when they reviewed the final expenses. The incident became a running joke among the cast and crew, though it certainly wasn't the first time that a Hollywood film had incurred unexpected costs because of what one crew member reportedly called a reckless jackass. Fact 3. Leonard Cohen had never heard of Mass. When Robert Altman realized that Leonard Cohen's haunting songs would be perfect for his unconventional Western, he faced what seemed like an impossible licensing challenge that led to one of the most amusing misunderstandings in Hollywood history. The problem was that McCabe and Mrs. Miller was being produced by Warner Brothers, while Cohen's music was released through Columbia Records, which meant the studio would have to pay significant money to a competing company for the rights to use the songs. Altman had fallen in love with Cohen's debut album, Songs of Leonard Cohen, from 1967, playing it so many times that he wore out multiple vinyl copies and had to keep buying new ones. During post-production, he discovered that several songs from the album seemed to fit perfectly with the scenes he had already filmed, as if they had been written specifically for the movie. The director was particularly drawn to the Stranger song, Sisters of Mercy, and Winter Lady, which captured the melancholy and isolation that defined his vision for the film. Confident that his recent massive success with MASH would give him the leverage he needed, Altman personally called Leonard Cohen to negotiate for the music rights. He expected to use his reputation as the director of one of 1970's biggest hits to convince the singer-songwriter to license his songs at a reasonable price. However, when Altman mentioned MASH during their conversation, Cohen's response completely caught him off guard. The Canadian musician had absolutely no idea what MASH was and had never heard of the film that made Altman famous. Instead, Cohen told Altman that he was a huge fan of Brewster McCloud, which was the director's follow-up movie that had been a commercial disappointment and critical puzzle that most audiences ignored. Cohen's enthusiasm for Altman's strangest and least successful film created an instant connection between the two artists that went far beyond business negotiations. This unexpected bond led Cohen to arrange for his record company to license the music at an extremely low cost, and he even wrote a unique clause into the contract stating that any increase in album sales after the movie's release would result in additional royalties going directly to Altman. Fact 4. The cinematographer was Oscar ineligible for Guild reasons. Vilmos Z. Sigmund created one of the most visually distinctive and influential films of 1971 with his groundbreaking cinematography for McCabe Mrs. Miller, but a bureaucratic technicality prevented him from receiving the recognition he deserved at the Academy Awards. The Hungarian-born cinematographer had developed a revolutionary technique called flashing that gave the entire movie its dreamy, faded appearance that looked like old photographs from the early 1900s. The flashing process involved lightly exposing the film negative to a controlled amount of light before actually shooting the scenes, which created a muted color palette and soft, ethereal quality that had never been seen in a major Hollywood production. This technique was extremely risky because it made it much harder to set proper exposure levels and increased the chances of ruining the entire batch of film if something went wrong during processing. Z. Sigmund and Altman also used multiple filters on the cameras to further enhance the vintage look, deliberately avoiding any post-production manipulation so that the studio couldn't force them to change the film's distinctive appearance. Critics immediately noticed and praised the movie's unique visual style, with many reviews specifically mentioning the cinematography as one of the film's greatest strengths. The haunting, almost ghostly quality of the images perfectly matched the melancholy tone of Leonard Cohen's songs and the tragic story of McCabe's doomed relationship with Mrs. Miller. Industry professionals recognized that Z. Sigmund had achieved something truly special that would influence how westerns and period films were photographed for years to come. However, when the Academy Award nominations were announced, Z. Sigmund's innovative work was completely ignored, but not because the voters didn't appreciate his artistry. The real reason was that he wasn't a member of the American Society of Cinematographers, which was required for eligibility in the cinematography category. The guild membership rule meant that his revolutionary technique was essentially invisible to the Academy, despite earning widespread critical acclaim and changing how movies could look. Sigmund finally joined the American Society of Cinematographers in 1973 and went on to receive 4 Oscar nominations, winning in 1978 for Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Fact 5. Warren Beatty did 30+ takes while Altman left. Warren Beatty's perfectionist approach to acting created one of the most memorable power struggles during the production of McCabe Mrs. Miller, leading to a standoff that revealed the fundamental differences between how the star and director preferred to work. Beatty was known throughout Hollywood for his meticulous attention to detail and his insistence on doing multiple takes of every scene until he felt completely satisfied with his performance, regardless of how long it took or how much it cost the production. On one particular day during filming, Altman had finished shooting what he considered to be perfectly acceptable takes of a scene and was ready to wrap for the day and move on to the next setup. However, Beatty insisted that they needed to continue filming because he wasn't happy with his performance and wanted to try different approaches to the dialogue and blocking. This type of disagreement was fairly common on movie sets, but what happened next was definitely not standard Hollywood protocol. Rather than argue with his star or try to convince him that they had enough usable footage, Altman simply walked away from the set and left his assistant director in charge of accommodating Beatty's demands. The director essentially called Beatty's bluff by removing himself from the situation entirely, forcing the actor to continue working without any input or guidance from the person who was supposed to be making the creative decisions about the film. Beatty apparently took this as a challenge and proceeded to do more than 30 additional takes of the same scene, with the assistant director rolling camera and the crew going through the motions. The actor worked through different line readings, emotional approaches, and physical movements while Altman was presumably back in his hotel room or having dinner, completely unconcerned about the expensive film stock and crew overtime that Beatty's perfectionism was costing the production. This incident became legendary among the cast and crew, and Altman later got his revenge by deliberately ordering Beatty to do 25 takes of a particularly uncomfortable scene that required the actor to perform in heavy snow and freezing weather conditions. Fact 6. The final 20 minutes used different film technique. Robert Altman made a deliberate and dramatic shift in the visual style of McCabe and Mrs. Miller during the final 20 minutes of the film, abandoning the dreamy, soft-focus technique that had defined the entire movie up to that point. Throughout most of the film, Altman and cinematographer Vilmos Zsigmond had used a revolutionary process called flashing that gave every scene a faded, antique photograph appearance that made the story feel like a distant memory or a beautiful dream about the Old West. This flashing technique involved exposing the film negative to a small amount of light before shooting, which created muted colors, reduced contrast, and gave the images an ethereal, almost ghostly quality that perfectly matched the melancholy tone of Leonard Cohen's songs and the tragic romance between McCabe and Mrs. Miller. The visual style made the entire town of Presbyterian Church look like it was suspended in time, existing somewhere between reality and fantasy. However, when the story reaches its climax, and McCabe faces the 3 hired killers who have come to murder him, Altman wanted audiences to feel the sudden shift from romantic tragedy to immediate, life-threatening danger. The moment when McCabe wakes up, grabs his shotgun, and heads toward the church marks the exact point where the film's visual style changes completely, and viewers can actually notice the difference if they're paying attention. From that moment forward, the movie was shot using normal film techniques without any flashing or special filters, which made the colors more vivid, the contrast sharper, and the images much more realistic and immediate. This change wasn't an accident or a mistake in the film processing, but a carefully planned artistic decision that Altman believed would make the audience feel McCabe's terror and desperation more intensely. The visual shift from dreamlike beauty to harsh reality mirrors the emotional journey of the story, as McCabe's romantic illusions about his life with Mrs. Miller are suddenly replaced by the brutal truth that powerful men will kill him rather than let him keep his independence and dignity. Fact 7. Stanley Kubrick called about the zoom shots. One of the most unexpected phone calls that Robert Altman ever received came from Stanley Kubrick, the legendary perfectionist director behind 2001, A Space Odyssey and Dr. Strangelove, who was so impressed by a single shot in McCabe and Mrs. Miller that he felt compelled to personally contact Altman to discuss the filmmaking technique involved. The shot that caught Kubrick's attention was a simple but beautifully composed moment early in the film where McCabe lights a cigar before crossing a bridge into the town of Presbyterian Church. This particular scene might seem unremarkable to casual viewers, but Kubrick recognized something extraordinary in the way Altman and cinematographer Vilmos Zsigmond had used the zoom lens to capture McCabe's entrance into the story. Throughout McCabe and Mrs. Miller, Altman employed zoom lenses in innovative ways that were completely different from how other directors typically used them, combining zooming movements with pans and dolly shots to create a fluid, almost breathing quality to the camera work. According to Altman, Kubrick called him specifically to ask about this cigar lighting shot, wanting to know, "How did you know you had it?" The question revealed Kubrick's appreciation for the instinctive filmmaking decisions that had produced such a memorable moment, and his recognition that Altman had achieved something special that went beyond technical skill into the realm of artistic intuition. The conversation between the two directors also revealed an interesting exchange about creative control and trust on movie sets. When Kubrick praised the incredible zoom lens shots throughout the film and asked if Altman had operated the camera himself, Altman replied that his cinematographer Vilmos Zsigmond was responsible for the camera work. Kubrick's immediate response was, "And you trust him?" which showed his amazement that any director would give a cinematographer that much creative freedom. This phone call became a legendary moment for Altman, representing recognition from one of cinema's most demanding and respected artists that McCabe and Mrs. Miller had achieved something truly innovative in terms of visual storytelling and camera movement. Fact 8. Elliot Gould tried to get Altman fired from Mass H. During the production of McCabe and Mrs. Miller, Elliot Gould reached out to Robert Altman to make a confession that completely shocked the director and revealed just how turbulent the making of Mass H had actually been behind the scenes. Gould had originally been offered the lead role of McCabe, but he turned it down to star in a different film called I Love My Wife, a decision that Altman told him was the mistake of your life at the time. The relationship between Gould and Altman had been complicated ever since they worked together on MASH in 1970, where Gould played the irreverent army surgeon Hawkeye Pierce, alongside Donald Sutherland's trapper John McIntyre. While MASH became a massive hit that launched Altman's career and made both actors major stars, the actual filming process had been filled with tension and conflicts that most people in Hollywood never knew about. According to Altman's account of their conversation during McCabe and Mrs. Miller, Gould contacted him specifically to admit that he and Donald Sutherland had actually tried to have Altman removed as the director of Mass H while they were still in the middle of production. Gould told Altman directly, "We went in and tried to get you fired," which must have been an incredibly awkward thing to confess to the man who had given him one of his most famous roles. Gould's reason for bringing up this old betrayal was that he wanted to apologize and acknowledge that he and Sutherland had been wrong about Altman's abilities as a director. He said simply, "We were wrong." And Altman's response was equally direct when he agreed with that assessment. The fact that Gould felt compelled to make this confession years later suggests that he had come to understand just how talented Altman was and how foolish their attempt to sabotage him had been. Despite this rocky history, Altman was apparently willing to forgive and forget, because Gould went on to appear in several more Altman films after their reconciliation during the McCabe and Mrs. Miller period. Fact 9. The cast and crew actually lived in the town. Robert Altman took the concept of method filmmaking to an extreme level during the production of McCabe and Mrs. Miller by encouraging his cast and crew members to actually live inside the fictional town of Presbyterian Church that they had constructed in the mountains of West Vancouver. The elaborate set wasn't just a collection of movie facades designed to look good from certain camera angles, but rather a fully functional frontier community complete with working buildings, genuine lumber construction, and all the details necessary to support people who were actually living there for months at a time. Altman had originally planned to build the town gradually as filming progressed, using local carpenters who were dressed in period costumes so that if they accidentally walked through a shot while the cameras were rolling, they would look like authentic 19th century workers rather than modern construction crews. This approach meant that the buildings were constructed with real materials and genuine craftsmanship, rather than the typical Hollywood shortcuts that create impressive exteriors with empty shells behind them. The director told everyone involved in the production that if they wanted to find a place to sleep on the set, they were welcome to claim any building or space that appealed to them and make it their temporary home. Many cast members, crew workers, and even some of the local carpenters took advantage of this unusual offer and spent their nights in the saloons, boarding houses, and other structures that made up the growing town. This living arrangement created an incredibly authentic atmosphere that extended far beyond what the cameras could capture, because people were actually experiencing what it might have been like to live in a remote frontier settlement. Cast members would wake up in their period costumes, step outside into the muddy streets, and immediately be surrounded by the sights, sounds, and smells of the world their characters inhabited. Keith Carradine later described the experience as uncanny, and said that Presbyterian Church seemed like a real place to everyone in the movie, because it actually was a real place where they were all living and working together for the duration of the 4-month shoot. Fact 10. Keith Carradine's audition lasted 1 minute. Keith Carradine's path to landing his breakthrough role in McCabe and Mrs. Miller involved what might be the shortest and most casual audition process in Hollywood history, consisting of a conversation that barely lasted 60 seconds and contained almost no discussion of acting ability or previous experience. At the time, Carradine was a 20-year-old aspiring actor who had recently appeared in the Broadway production of Hair and was looking for opportunities to break into film work, but he had very little experience with movie auditions or the typical Hollywood casting process. Robert Altman had a completely unconventional approach to choosing actors for his films, preferring to rely on his instincts about people's personalities and natural behavior rather than asking them to perform scenes or demonstrate their acting skills in traditional ways. Altman believed that the essence of who someone was as a person was more important than their technical abilities, and he had developed a reputation for casting actors based on brief meetings, where he simply tried to get a sense of their character and authenticity. When Carradine met with Altman about the role of the young cowboy in McCabe and Mrs. Miller, the entire audition consisted of just 3 questions and 3 answers. Altman asked, "Did you read the script?" And Carradine answered, "Yeah." Then Altman asked, "Did you read the part?" And Carradine again responded, "Yeah." Finally, Altman asked, "Do you want to do it?" And when Carradine said "yeah" for the 3rd time, Altman simply told him, "Okay," and that was the end of the audition process. Carradine later recalled that Altman never asked anyone to read lines or perform scenes during auditions, but instead would meet with potential actors and speak with them just long enough to decide whether the person he perceived them to be would provide the right essence for the character he had in mind. This approach worked perfectly for Carradine, whose natural innocence and wide-eyed enthusiasm at age 20 was exactly what Altman wanted for the role of the naive young cowboy. Fact 11. Shelley Duvall was discovered at a house party. Shelley Duvall's entry into Hollywood happened in the most unexpected way possible when Robert Altman spotted her at a casual house party in Houston, Texas, and immediately decided that she had to be in his next movie, even though she had absolutely no acting experience or interest in becoming a performer. At the time, Duvall was working as a cosmetics saleswoman and had studied nutrition in college, living a completely ordinary life that had nothing to do with the entertainment industry or any kind of artistic ambitions. Altman was in Houston during 1970 filming his quirky comedy Brewster McCloud when he attended a party at Duvall's house, which she was hosting for her boyfriend at the time. The director was immediately fascinated by Duvall's unique appearance and her natural, unaffected personality that seemed completely genuine and free of any pretense or artificiality. He watched her interact with other people at the party and became convinced that her authentic behavior and distinctive look would be perfect for the unconventional characters he liked to feature in his films. When Altman approached Duvall and told her that he wanted to cast her in Brewster McCloud, she was completely stunned and insisted that he must be making a mistake. She repeatedly told him, "I'm not an actress," because she had never taken any acting classes, never performed in school plays, and had never even considered the possibility of working in movies or television. Duvall genuinely believed that Altman had confused her with someone else, or that he didn't understand what being an actress actually involved. However, Altman was absolutely certain about his decision and famously replied, "Oh yes, you are," with the kind of confidence that suggested he could see something in her that she couldn't see in herself. This exchange became legendary in Hollywood as an example of how Altman could recognize natural talent and authenticity that traditional casting directors might have overlooked. Duvall's performance in Brewster McCloud led directly to her role in McCabe and Mrs. Miller, where she played the mail-order bride who becomes one of McCabe's prostitutes after her husband dies. Fact 12. The steam engine actually powered the lumber mill. The impressive steam engine that dramatically delivers Mrs. Miller to the town of Presbyterian Church in one of the film's most memorable scenes wasn't just a movie prop or a non-functioning piece of period equipment, but rather a genuine working steam locomotive that the production crew put to practical use long after the cameras stopped rolling. This attention to authentic detail was typical of Robert Altman's approach to creating the world of McCabe and Mrs. Miller, where he insisted on using real materials and functioning equipment whenever possible to maintain the illusion that Presbyterian Church was an actual frontier town rather than a movie set. After filming the spectacular sequence where the steam engine arrives, pulling a flat car loaded with Mrs. Miller and her entourage of experienced prostitutes, the crew discovered that they had a valuable piece of working machinery on their hands that could serve multiple purposes during the months-long production. Rather than simply moving the locomotive off the set or letting it sit idle, they decided to connect it to the lumber mill that they had constructed as part of the town's industrial infrastructure. The lumber mill was another example of Altman's commitment to authenticity, as it was built to actually function rather than simply look impressive from certain camera angles. The mill needed a reliable source of power to operate the saws, conveyor belts, and other machinery that would be visible in various scenes throughout the movie, and the steam engine provided exactly the kind of period-appropriate energy source that would have been used in a real 1902 mining town. This practical arrangement meant that throughout the filming period, The lumber mill was actually producing real lumber and functioning as a genuine industrial operation, with the steam engine providing the power that kept everything running smoothly. The constant operation of both the engine and the mill added authentic sounds, smells, and activity to the set that enhanced the performances of the actors and created a more convincing atmosphere for the cameras to capture during the many scenes that took place around the town's industrial areas. Fact 13. Real snow forced the movie's most famous scenes. The haunting final gunfight sequence that takes place in heavy snow and has become one of the most memorable and visually striking endings in Western movie history was never supposed to happen the way audiences see it on screen, because Robert Altman had originally planned to film those climactic scenes under completely different weather conditions. The production of McCabe Mrs. Miller had been carefully scheduled to take advantage of the fall and winter filming season in West Vancouver, but the weather had been relatively mild throughout most of the shoot, allowing the crew to work without the complications that heavy snow and freezing temperatures typically create. When it came time to film the final two scenes of the movie, which involved the church catching fire and McCabe's deadly confrontation with the three hired killers, the weather suddenly changed and it began snowing heavily across the entire filming location. Warren Beatty was opposed to shooting in these conditions because he was concerned about continuity issues, arguing that if they filmed the ending scenes in the snow, they would have to go back and reshoot the rest of the movie in similar weather to maintain visual consistency throughout the film. However, Altman saw the unexpected snowfall as a creative opportunity rather than a production problem, and he convinced Beatty and the rest of the cast and crew that the snow would actually enhance the dramatic impact of McCabe's final desperate struggle for survival. The director argued that since these were the only scenes left to film, they didn't need to worry about matching the weather conditions with earlier parts of the movie, and the snow would create a perfect metaphor for McCabe's isolation and impending doom. The decision to embrace the natural weather conditions resulted in 9 days of filming in genuine blizzard conditions, with the cast and crew working in waist-high snowdrifts that were completely real rather than the artificial snow that Hollywood typically uses for winter scenes. The final images of McCabe dying alone in the snow while the townspeople celebrate saving their church create a powerful visual contrast that perfectly captures the film's themes about loneliness and abandonment. Fact 14. Julie Christie charged Warren Beatty for sex scenes. One of the most brutally honest and emotionally devastating aspects of the relationship between McCabe and Mrs. Miller was the fact that even as their romantic feelings for each other grew stronger, she continued to charge him $5 every time they were intimate, treating their most personal moments as strictly business transactions. This detail wasn't something that Robert Altman added for shock value or to make the story more provocative, but rather a deliberate choice that revealed the fundamental nature of Mrs. Miller's character and her complete inability to separate love from commerce. The $5 fee that Mrs. Miller charged McCabe was actually her top price, the same amount that the wealthiest and most important customers in the town would pay for her services, which meant that she wasn't giving McCabe any kind of romantic discount or treating him differently from any other client. This arrangement created one of the most heartbreaking dynamics in the entire film, because audiences could see that McCabe genuinely cared for Mrs. Miller and hoped that their business partnership might eventually develop into something deeper and more meaningful. The movie presents their intimate scenes in a way that initially makes viewers assume that McCabe and Mrs. Miller have become lovers in the traditional sense, but then reveals through subtle details and dialogue that money is still changing hands every time they sleep together. This revelation comes as a shock to both the audience and to McCabe himself, who gradually realizes that Mrs. Miller views everything in their relationship through the lens of profit and loss. McCabe's growing frustration with this arrangement becomes clear in the private conversations he has with himself throughout the film, where he expresses his longing for genuine affection by saying things like, "If just one time you could be sweet without money to it." These moments reveal how desperately he wants Mrs. Miller to show him some sign that their connection means more to her than just another business deal, but she remains consistently focused on the financial aspects of every interaction they have together, even the most intimate ones. Fact 15. Altman compared the business negotiations to agent meetings. Robert Altman drew direct inspiration for some of the most tense and realistic scenes in McCabe and Mrs. Miller from his own experiences watching Hollywood agents negotiate contracts for actors, transforming the cutthroat world of entertainment industry deal-making into the corporate takeover attempts that threaten McCabe's small business empire. The scenes where the Harrison Shaughnessy Mining Company representatives try to buy out McCabe's brothel and gambling operations weren't based on research about historical business practices in the early 1900s, but rather on Altman's first-hand observations of how modern entertainment industry power brokers operated when they wanted to acquire or control someone's career. According to Altman's own commentary about the film, he had spent considerable time watching agents negotiate actors' contracts and had been struck by the combination of smooth talk, veiled threats, and corporate intimidation that characterized these supposedly civilized business meetings. The director recognized that the fundamental dynamics of these negotiations remained essentially the same, whether they involved a Hollywood star trying to maintain creative control over their career, or a frontier entrepreneur trying to keep his independence from a powerful mining corporation. The agents and studio executives that Altman observed used many of the same tactics that the mining company representatives employ against McCabe, including making initial offers that seem generous but are actually far below what the property or talent is actually worth, followed by subtle implications about what might happen to people who refuse to cooperate with larger and more powerful organizations. Altman was particularly fascinated by how these Hollywood negotiations often involved people who presented themselves as friendly and reasonable, while simultaneously making it clear that rejection of their offers could result in serious consequences for the person's future career prospects. This blend of false friendliness and underlying menace translated perfectly to the Western setting, where the mining company's representatives smile and speak politely to McCabe while making it obvious that refusing their offer will result in his death. The director's decision to base these crucial scenes on contemporary Hollywood politics added a layer of social commentary that connected the film's 19th-century setting to the corporate power struggles that were happening in Altman's own industry during the early 1970s.